Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about some more advanced topics with A360 Collaboration for Revit. This presentation, as Scott already pointed out, is really oriented towards IT professionals. We're assuming that you have at least a basic familiarity with cloud services, Revit products, how Revit functions on a basic level. It's also very helpful if you have a basic understanding of A360 Collaboration for Revit. We're not going to go into too much detail about, how it works or looking at the web portal. We're really going to be talking more about things such as how it compares to Revit Server. We're going to review some of the requirements and prerequisites for using the software, how you would do local backups and record copies, and we're going to go over briefly user management, roles, and security, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session. So to start with, let's do a quick comparison to Revit Server. Some of you are probably already using Revit Server and are very familiar with how it functions. Some of you may not be quite as familiar or looking into it or haven't implemented it yet. The basic idea behind Revit Server is that you're connecting an office to office, really point to point in that respect. So if you look at our example typical topology, you would have your host, which kind of acts like your central model spot in New York, and then you have Seattle and Los Angeles connecting directly to New York in accelerator as accelerator functions. So the idea is that basically anybody in the Seattle office who has Revit configured properly would be able to collaborate in pretty much real time with models that are also being worked on in New York or Los Angeles. So it's typically, but not always, as fast as your weakest link. So that's one consideration to keep in mind. So in this scenario, if the Seattle accelerator has high latency to New York, this is very likely to affect performance in all three locations. Revit Server is also fairly sensitive to latency in particular, less so to bandwidth, but both of them, if they tend to be on the slow side, can impact performance. Again, they can also impact performance across the entire Revit Server network. In terms of scaling, it doesn't always scale well. In some situations, it can actually scale quite easily. So for example, if you have 3 people in Los Angeles who are working on Revit Server, you need a 4th person to connect to Revit Server. Usually, if you don't already have the rsn.ini file configured, you just drop that on the machine. And that's pretty much it. They're good to go because it's integrated into Revit already, Revit 2015. The only problem is that on a per site basis, usually you can scale it up, 10, 15, maybe 20 people, depending on the hardware that you have running. Once you go beyond that, you might start running into some issues. It does require a bit of end-user maintenance. In most cases, this is just performance tuning and making sure that everything works right. Unfortunately, as with any Revit model, you can run into situations where something on the Revit server either compounds or is involved in corruption. Not very often, but it can happen. It is really optimal for internal use. So, for example, if your New York, Seattle, and Los Angeles are all just, 3 offices belonging to the same firm, it's very easy for that, and it's really kind of designed for that. You can use it with third parties. You do have to take some extra precautions, and on a fundamental level, you have to keep in mind that when you do connect Revit Server to a third party, first of all, everything on that host is going to be available on that accelerator. It really isn't granular security in that sense. And also on a very fundamental level, what you're doing is you're basically taking an IIS server and connecting it directly to another office. So again, it's not really that bad. It's not a major issue. You just have to be careful about how you're configuring it and setting it up. And one really strong benefit of Revit Server is that it stays under control of the IT department. So as we all know, the IT department, even if it's a cloud service, the IT department is basically being held responsible for the security and safety and integrity of the data. So in this case, with Revit Server, the IT staff will have direct access to the Revit servers. It's on their hardware. They can do whatever they need to make sure that it's working properly, that it's tuned, and that you have local backups. Collaboration for Revit works significantly differently. As you can see, the topology is actually quite a bit different. It works anywhere in North America. So as far as we know, that does include Canada and Mexico. It uses Amazon's S3 servers in Virginia. It is possible that there may be some latency issues when connecting from other areas or depending upon your bandwidth. At this time, we haven't really heard of any major problems, but you should keep in mind this is one reason why they have not currently expanded to Asia or Europe. We do not have an ETA. We do know that they want to do this, but they have not said when they're actually going to go ahead and do it. Minimal IT setup, we're actually going to go over the most of the steps that are required. It's very minimal, especially compared to Revit Server. With Revit Server, you're going to have to build the server, you're going to have to configure it, you're going to have to test it, and then you have to make sure that all the connections are working. With Collaboration for Revit, really all that you have to do is install a couple of items on the client machine, and that's it. And actually, one thing I just want to point out, you can use Collaboration for Revit anywhere that you've got an internet connection. So unlike Revit Server, which is really office to office, Collaboration for Revit will work if you have 2 people in an office, if you have 4 people in an office who need to connect, if you have someone who is who's doing contract management. So let's say you're making a building in Houston and you have someone who's on site. As long as they have an internet connection and a copy of licensed Revit 2015 on their computer, they will be able to work in real time on the models that everyone else in the organization can connect to. And you can also do the same with consultants. So let's say you've got an acoustic consultant who's in Seattle. They can go into the project and work in real time, and it won't necessarily connect to anyone else in that office, and it won't copy any data other than the project data. Minimal maintenance, again, most of the maintenance is really happening at Amazon's S3 servers and with Autodesk's Collaboration for Revit implementation. So there will occasionally be maintenance windows. They do usually schedule those at times when you're not likely to use them. But for the most part, you really don't have to do a lot of maintenance as an IT consultant or a professional. It scales fairly well. I do want to point out this is a new service. We don't actually know what's going to happen when it ramps up, but as far as we can tell, it should scale quite well. Again, Amazon S3 has resources that any individual office really cannot establish. So if you have to change overnight from 10 people on your projects to 100 people collaborating in real time on your projects, you really aren't going to see any problems, and it's going to be much, much faster to scale up than with Collaboration for Revit, with the possible exception of having people in a specific office who just need to add, maybe 10 or 15 people. It's a little more secure with third parties. Again, we'll see a little later when we talk about the projects, but basically you're not opening a connection from one office to another. The only thing that you're really transferring or collaborating on in real time is Revit files. So this should be fairly secure with third parties, but we will discuss a little more in detail about that. The downside, again, is that the environment is not under direct IT control. This is basically the same as with any cloud service. So this should be pretty straightforward. And again, that's critical for some environments, especially large environments I've found tend to prefer to have that kind of control. Small offices, I think, are going to benefit quite a bit from this because they're less concerned sometimes about that structure, or they may not have the IT resources to dedicate to Revit Server. A few other items about Collaboration for Revit and how it works. Basically, it's going to run a small program which will show up in Task Manager as revitaccelerator.exe. It's going to run in the background. It's going to create and update local cache copies. We'll talk a little more about this later, but it's critical to realize these are not fully accessible copies, but what it's going to do is anytime there's a change and someone does a sync to central, it's basically going to distribute all those changes via Amazon S3 and via that Revit accelerator.exe. So let's say, for example, you have a architectural staff member who is working on a project. They're using Collaboration for Revit, and they go on vacation for a week. If they leave their computer on, then it's going to get all the latest changes in the background, and it will be very fast and easy for them to turn on and get working right away when they come back. The backups are basically run at Autodesk 360 servers. We'll review that again a little later. One thing to keep in mind is that you do have to go through a process in order to make a local backup or a local record copy. But for the most part, it is Amazon S3 service and Collaboration for Revit, which is handling the backup procedures. It's a little more difficult to make offline copies. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The performance target is what they classify it as Revit Server at the accelerator side. For those of you who are not familiar with Revit Server, generally speaking, again, you're working off of files that are stored on the local workstation. So most of what you're doing should be at normal speed. Some functions such as open, close, sync to central might be a little bit slower, but it's not that bad. In terms of the requirements, again, minimal infrastructure requirements. Basically, you just need a fairly robust internet connection. The things that I've heard bandied about are 2 megabits per second per user. So, and obviously, if there's less activity, such as at night, then it's not going to use up a lot. So the most critical one is that you have to be on the latest version of Revit, which at this time is update release 7. You also have to have the latest version of Collaboration for Revit. And yes, in 2015, this is a separate application, a separate package that you have to install. At this time, it's currently on version 4. And it's one thing to keep in mind is that when Autodesk puts out a new version of Collaboration for Revit, the changes are not just happening at the workstation. They're also making changes at the central server at Amazon S3. So it's much more critical than in the past to make sure that everybody is on the latest version of Revit and has the latest version of Collaboration for Revit. Another little potential gotcha, if you happen to install a newer version of Collaboration for Revit than the latest update release, you will probably get a DB access error. And all you have to do really is just install the latest Revit update release, and that should be fine. But this does mean that you have to be more diligent about rolling out the latest version of Revit and pushing out the latest version of Collaboration for Revit. So you may want to start using some tools to do that. Fortunately, it's actually deployed fairly easily and already in the Autodesk Application Manager. For those of you who are not familiar with this, it's a new application which helps keep all of your Autodesk applications up to date. It runs on the individual client. So what would typically happen is if you are behind on a version of Collaboration for Revit, the user will open the application. They'll open Revit 2015. They'll get a little pop-up saying, your version is out of date. Do you want to update now? And if you click yes, then it's going to pop open the application manager with the updates that you need. In terms of backup and rolling back, basically Collaboration for Revit takes snapshots every time that you do sync to central, and that's for all the users who are connected to a specific model. And you can actually roll back, and I'll do a demo of that in a moment. So one thing to keep in mind when you do this, all newer versions are deleted, and this action cannot be undone. So it is absolutely critical for you to recognize, yeah, sure. I'll do a demo of showing how you actually roll back using Collaboration for Revit, but I just want to be clear, when you roll back to an earlier version, all newer versions are deleted. You cannot undo this. And if someone is in the model, then similar to what would happen in Revit, if you overwrite a model while people are in it, they will receive a notification that their version is no longer compatible, and any new changes that they've done will be orphaned. Another thing to be careful of, again, collaboration for Revit does not make any usable local versions. In fact, when you open a model, you'll see detach from central and create new local are grayed out. There is currently no automated system to create offline copies. So I myself have put in a request for this. I've been mentioning that since it was in beta as Project Skyscraper. So it's not clear if or when they will do it, but we will be pushing for them to do it because obviously you all know as IT people, that can be a critical task. And obviously, as we just discussed, when you do roll back, you could lose a number of changes, and that can be problematic. So offline copies and record copies are very important. So basically, in order to do this yourself, what you have to do is a function called publish. You have to publish the drawings and then download them from the A360 portal. And publishing is also required to push the latest version of Autodesk 360. So as some of you may know, if you've looked into Collaboration for Revit at all, there's a portion where mobile users can look at a model, they can look at the sheets, they can do 3D views. In order for people to see the latest version, you have to publish it. And one good thing, anytime that a model version is published, you can download that version from 360. So let's do a little demo of that. So here we are in Revit. And actually, I'll just show you this real quick. In order to open a model, you just go to A360. And here are our models. So to publish, you have to go to the Collaborate tab. And actually, you know what, let's make a little change here. And we'll do a synchronize with central so you can see how long it takes. And this is on just a standard Ethernet connection with a fairly normal internet connection, which happens to be also running our webinar. And it'll just be one more minute. Hopefully. Okay, there we go. So to look at older versions and to publish versions, we're going to go to Manage A360 Models. And you'll see we have our different projects here. We're going to look at our test project. And here you can see for this project, it's already got the latest version published. With this one, as you can see, I did a sync to central, so we're just going to publish that. And as you can see, we've got a little bit of visual feedback telling us that it's in the act of publishing. And this process doesn't take very long either. All right, so we're all set. Now this icon here is a set of actions. We could rename the model, relinquish, you can delete it, and we're going to view versions. So in this case, every time that I've done a sync to central, it's got a version. And this is where we can roll back. And again, if I roll back to the version on 4.01.12.13, it's going to wipe out all these more recent versions. Again, very critical to keep that in mind. Now, one good thing about this, if you're doing this from an IT perspective, once you log in, you can publish, you can see all the models that are in a project, and you can basically just start publishing all of them. So if you have 2 or 3 models, 4, 5, 6, you can just publish them. So that's actually a fairly easy step. And now let's go into our A360 account. I'm going to go into our test account and go to data. So here we can see, this is really good to know, the type you can see now is saying cloud as opposed to a Revit file. I think that's a new feature in version 4. Previously it wouldn't tell you. So let's say that I want to download our 2 cloud projects. Hit download. As you can see, it's going to create a compressed file so that it will actually be a little quicker to download. You can also download them individually, and I don't believe that it compresses when you download. So this should be a fairly straightforward process if you're doing this, once a quarter, once a week. It shouldn't take very long. Now, as I said, you can also go to older published versions. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is the interface in A360. So over here we have our model, and you can look at this in real time. You can look at views and sheets. So this icon here is the versions. So this, every time that I hit publish, it's a version here, and I can download any of these. So there's our sample Revit file. So hopefully at some point they will automate this process. In the meantime, it's not that difficult, but it is something you would have to manually do and schedule on your own. So now let's talk a little bit about roles and security, and obviously this is a very important topic when using any cloud service, and especially one which has this data on it. So there are 3 types of projects, and some of the terms you won't be familiar with right away, like team members or project contributors. I'll explain those terms in a moment. But basically, if you have an open project, then anyone who's a team member, which is basically someone in your organization who you've synchronized to your hub, all those people can see and access that data. That's going to include any chat data. It's going to mean they can rename or work on or delete or download those models and that data. They can also search it as well. If you have a closed project, it's a little more restricted. So team members can view, but in order to actually work on it, they have to be invited. Project contributors will have to be invited as well. And then there's secret projects. Secret projects are only visible to invited participants. So there is a function, team administrator, which has a little more power than a team member. And team administrators will be able to see that the secret project exists, but they can't actually access the content. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is that once you get someone connected to a project, they will be able to see all the data in it. So if I invite someone to work on my C4R test 9751000.00 project, they'll be able to access all of this data. So that's something you're going to have to keep in mind when working with third parties, or depending on what you're working on, it may even be internal as well. So if, for example, you're doing a project with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City, they're going to have a whole bunch of internal requirements in addition to external. So you may need to create projects that other people cannot access or will not see. So in those cases, you might need to do a closed or a secret project. Now, in terms of roles, I do have to warn you, it's a little bit complex. So I'm not going to go into specific detail about every single role and every function. I'm just going to do a basic overview. And I do want to point out that, unfortunately, graphical representations don't always make it much clearer. So the basic idea is that a team, someone who's on the team or a team role is connected to your own company's account, Autodesk account. If you're in a project, if you have paid, you have certain functions and roles, and for the most part, project contributors are going to be external people. So one critical thing, the team owner is also the contract administrator. So one thing which might make this a little clearer is that Collaboration for Revit is actually using a new Autodesk function, which is A360 Team, which basically is just another way of kind of organizing all this project data. So a lot of the things about the projects and the roles and securities also apply to A360 Team. So the contract administrator for your firm will also become your team owner. What this means is that they get to assign licenses to individuals, and they also create your hub. As a result, they are always given a Collaboration for Revit seat on a new contract by default. So you can move that license from one user to another without any problems. It's not going to cause any data disruptions. It's not going to remove that team owner role from that person. But you do have to just keep in mind, if you buy one seat, it's going to be assigned to your contract manager, and you're going to have to manually move that to another user. One of the key or primary roles is going to be team member. Again, this is basically someone who's within your organization, within your account. They can access all the open projects, they can see the closed projects, but can only access when invited, and they can only see secret when invited. So for the most part, when you add someone to your A360 hub, they're within your firm, they're using your licenses, they're going to be a team member. Project contributors are basically external or not in your organization. They will have access to anything in the projects they have joined, as we discussed earlier. And if you want them to collaborate in real time, they're going to have their own Collaboration for Revit license in order to collaborate with your projects. So if I'm working at architecture firm A and I have a Collaboration for Revit license, and any other firm can basically invite me to be a project contributor, and I can use that same Collaboration for Revit license that I've got for as many firms as happen to need to invite me. And in turn, you can have as many people working on and collaborating on your projects as long as they have the Collaboration for Revit license. That's what's key. So as you saw earlier, the roles is a little bit extensive. So what you want to do is you want to take a look at the summary of the project roles. I'm just going to pop that open real quick. So you may just want to take note of this web page and take a look for it on the Autodesk Knowledge Network. And we'll also try to distribute the link to this at some point. So this outlines and details all the functions and all the roles. I'll also do a demo just to show you how it looks in the management. So this is going to have comprehensive information on all of these roles. So you should definitely use this as a reference. And again, you have to keep in mind that when you're assigning someone, it's going to impact licensing. If they're a team member, it's going to impact their access if they're a team member or a project contributor. So you just have to be very careful, and I recommend just reviewing the roles and maybe taking some notes when you start distributing. So let's take a quick look at how those roles are assigned. So we go into the admin panel for the hub. So this is a little bit complex, but let's take a look at it real quick. So in our sign-up mode, this is something I haven't discussed too much. Basically, it's relating to invites. Inviting, unfortunately, can be a little bit complex, in part because different roles can make invitations, but only certain individuals can actually approve, and you can actually manage settings for that. So if you want it so that your IT person is the only, or your contract manager is the only one we can invite. You can set that here. And the same for project contributors. So when we look at team members, this shows us all our team members. One thing that's a little confusing here, you see this change role. You can't actually make someone an administrator here. You can only switch them between project contributor and team member. So if you want to make someone an administrator, you would go into Manage Administrators, add someone. So this section is basically, as far as I know, it's only available to contract administrators, aka team owners. So for the most part, if you're just setting up a project, you probably won't see this, but you most likely will need to talk to someone who is an admin to let them know what you're doing. You can also invite people to join. There's actually quite a few places within A360 where you can send out invitations, so that's very handy. One other thing that we can take a quick look at is how things look in your Autodesk account. So as you can see here, we have A360 Collaboration for Revit. We've got 8 seats. Usually, if you go to product info, by the way, this will take you to the application that I was talking about, the A360 Collaboration for Revit. I do have to point out this is a little bit outdated. This link takes you to version 3, and they're on version 4 now. So hopefully they'll get that updated soon. So let's say that you've got your seats and you want to assign someone to use a license. Oh, sorry. I guess it times out. So we're going to go into users. So here we have our list of users, and let's say I want to give Arun a license. I can see here that he doesn't have it, so I just hit Edit Access, and I can scroll down. Oh, here we go. So here's our collaboration for Revit. We can see that we have 7 seats available, and I can assign it. That's all pretty straightforward. If you don't have people added to your organization, you can just add them here.